Hello and welcome. I'm Lori Young, the Interim Director of the Wilderness Institute in the College of Forestry and Conservation here at the university, and we sponsor this lecture series. This is the 25th Annual Wilderness Issues Lecture Series. I know most of you have heard this a number of times now. The theme this year is Connecting Landscapes, Conservation Across Boundaries. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Ruth Watkins. And Ruth is going to talk with us about the Clark Fork watershed and her efforts to conserve that watershed across 3 states. In many ways, we've talked a little bit about watersheds before, but not really watershed conservation. We've talked about watershed science, basically, when we talked with Catherine Pringle about hydrological connectivity. Watershed conservation efforts, in many ways, are leading the way in conservation across boundaries. We've seen watershed groups and watershed management efforts just emerge all across the country in the last 20 years. And we've invited Ruth Watkins here from Idaho to talk about science and collaboration in the Clark Fork watershed, the watershed that we live in. Ruth Watkins is the program director for the Tri-State Water Quality Council in Sandpoint, Idaho, and she's responsible for on-the-ground programs and coordinating the work of the organization's various committees across the 3 states that the Clark Fork watershed runs through. She's also served as the organization's executive director. She was the executive director from 1993 until 2003, and has worked with a real diverse set of stakeholders on watershed planning. During this time, she has had a number of really important success stories, which include developing a nutrient reduction program, also called TMDL, if some of you are familiar with watershed conservation and management terminology, for the Montana portion of the Clark Fork River, which includes agreements with the major point source dischargers, which is a real accomplishment. She also facilitated a precedent-setting agreement between the states of Montana and Idaho to protect Lake Pend Oreille's water quality. Under her leadership, the Tri-State Water Quality Council received an inaugural $1 million National Watershed Initiative grant from the Environmental Protection Agency. Ruth has also worked with the Clark Fork Pend Oreille Coalition, the Priest Lake Coalition, and she currently serves on the Idaho Panhandle Basin Advisory Group and the Idaho Panhandle Resource Advisory Committee. In 1995, Ruth received an Outstanding Achievement Award from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And I think that we're really lucky to have Ruth here because she is a real leader in watershed conservation and a real seasoned veteran in working across state lines and working with different stakeholders, different groups of people, different land managers, landowners, and bringing those people together to get something done on the ground. So please welcome Ruth Watkins.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lori. That was a great introduction. A seasoned veteran. A young seasoned veteran. Well, thank you so much for having me here tonight. I always love talking about the Clark Fork Pend Oreille watershed, and I'm looking forward to visiting with you this evening and talking about, I'm going to touch on several different things to do with the watershed that I think are kind of what the kinds of information that you're looking for. I'm going to first give you a verbal tour of the watershed so that you understand a little bit more beyond what's going on here in the Missoula area because it is a huge watershed with a very complex set of issues. And then I'm going to talk specifically about our organization, and I'm going to tell you how we got started and who we are, because I think it's important for you to know how we got started in order for you to understand who we are. And then we're going to talk about how we do what we do. And I'm going to share that information with you through a couple of examples of some of the projects that we have worked on. And then I guess we open it up to questions and hopefully answers. So. Anyway, I just put together some comments this morning when I was sitting in my home in Hope, Idaho. I live in Hope, and always live in Hope. And I shared my comments with my cat, and she seemed to think that they were pretty appropriate. So I think we're probably going to do okay here. First of all, I thought I would explain, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, because I use the word watershed a lot, and I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what is a watershed. And assuming most of you in the room know that, but a watershed is a land area that drains into a body of water. So, for instance, if you have a pond and you have a land area around that pond and it rains, and the rainwater either gets absorbed into the ground or it evaporates into the air, or it travels over the ground as runoff and ends up in the pond. So in a larger context, a watershed then is a body of land that drains into a creek, drains into a stream, drains into a river, drains into a lake, and eventually drains into an ocean. So you have small watersheds that are a body of an area of land around a pond, and you have large watersheds like the Columbia River Basin that's huge. Within the Columbia River Basin is our little, and not so little, Clark Fork Pend Oreille watershed. The watershed is 16 million acres, or about 26,000 square miles. And it begins just outside of Butte, Montana. I don't know if any of you have been to the very beginnings of the Clark Fork River, but it starts out as a little tiny creek, and of course gains quite a bit of water and momentum by the time it gets here to Missoula. Along the way, it picks up water from a number of tributaries, including some large tributaries like the Blackfoot River and the Bitterroot River, of course. After it passes Missoula, picks up all the water from the Flathead watershed. The Flathead actually considerably dilutes any pollution that's going on in the Clark Fork. In fact, if the river, once the Flathead comes into the river, if the river were named by the volume of water, it would actually, after that point, probably be called the Flathead River, because that's where it gets most of its water at that point. So then all that water, that Clark Fork, is traveling down, passes the Idaho-Montana border and into Idaho, and after about 8 miles in Idaho, it dumps up into a little small pond that we call Lake Pend Oreille. Lake Pend Oreille is the largest lake in Idaho. It's the 4th largest lake in the West, has a depth of 1,200 feet, and a shoreline of over 120 miles. And it's a beautiful, beautiful lake. And from there, the water becomes the Pend Oreille River. In fact, if any of you have ever been to Sandpoint, you go into Sandpoint crossing the Long Bridge. If you were coming in from Coeur d'Alene, you cross the Long Bridge. And at the Long Bridge is actually the line of demarcation where Lake Pend Oreille ends and the Pend Oreille River begins. And then the Pend Oreille River travels across the rest of the Idaho Panhandle, west into Washington. And then when it gets into Washington, it starts flowing north, which is a little unusual, and it flows north through Pend Oreille County, Washington, and ends up in Canada. And after about 2 miles in Canada, it hooks around and joins the Columbia. And then it heads south back into the U.S. and, of course, across the west, where it then eventually makes its way to the Pacific Ocean. So, I don't know if you know this, but originally the Clark Fork River was called Clark's Fork of the Columbia, from the, of course, famous explorer. When Clark was out in this vicinity, it was named after Clark, and it was called Clark's Fork of the Columbia, and then eventually just got shortened to Clark's Fork, and then Clark Fork, and so that's a small, very small thumbnail sketch of our 26,000 square mile watershed. About 75% of the watershed is here in Montana. And as far as the impact of the watershed in Montana on the watershed in Idaho and Washington, Lake Pend Oreille gets 90% of its water from the Clark Fork River, and about 75 to 80% of its nutrient pollution comes from the Clark Fork River. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on across the watershed. And I want to be very clear what issues the Tri-State Water Quality Council is focused on, because there are a number of water quality issues in the watershed. One of them, of course, being heavy metals, heavy metal pollution in the upper river, particularly around Butte and Deer Lodge, up actually all the way down to till the Milltown Dam. There are areas that have been the focus of federal Superfund projects for a number of years, and so heavy metals pollution is certainly an issue in that reach of the watershed. There are other issues such as habitat alterations that have occurred, the construction of dams, total dissolved gas issues associated with the dams when there's a lot of huge flow of runoff in the spring and the dams have to spill a considerable amount of water. All of that water going into the river creates a dissolved gas that actually can kill fish and does kill fish in the lower Clark Fork River and Lake Pend Oreille when it reaches certain levels. So there's also nuisance aquatic weed infestations and problems. So there are a number of problems. The Tri-State Water Quality Council is focused specifically on nutrient pollution. And I'll tell you why in a few minutes. We'll get to when we talk about our history and how we got started. You'll understand why we're focused on nutrients. But why are nutrients a problem? Nutrients sound like such great things, and they are. It's just that even a great thing, if you get too much of it, becomes maybe not such a great thing anymore. So what happens is when nutrients get into a body of water, they act as a fertilizer. Just like you would put phosphorus and nitrogen as a fertilizer on your lawn to make your lawn grow green, if phosphorus and nitrogen get into a body of water, and too much phosphorus, because phosphorus and nitrogen do get into water naturally, and there's not much we can do about that, but too much phosphorus and too much nitrogen then acts as a pretty heavy-duty fertilizer and causes the extensive growth of algae and aquatic weeds. Now, we need algae and we need aquatic weeds, and the fish and the aquatic organisms living in our rivers and lakes certainly need algae and weeds. But when there's too much algae and too much aquatic weeds, they take up oxygen in the water, and they use up oxygen that the fish and other aquatic organisms need to live. So when you get too much algae and too much weed growth, it creates a problem. And it not just affects fish and aquatic organisms, it also can impair recreational uses. It can impact drinking water supplies. It can reduce water clarity. So there are a lot of impacts from algae. So our focus is we're trying to reduce the growth of algae in the Clark Fork River and Lake Pend Oreille and the Pend Oreille River. And to do that, we're focused on reducing nutrients that are getting into the system because that's what's causing the excessive growth of algae and weeds. Before I finish that topic, I just want to explain, for example, in the upper Clark Fork River, above Missoula, if you're around in the summertime and you're out on the river in the summertime or trying to get out on the river in the summertime, you'll notice long, thick, stringy growth of weeds in the river, and that's actually algae, and it's called Cladophora, and it's big, long, stringy. Longer than this, long strands, thick strands of and masses of Cladophora. When you get around the Missoula area and downstream of Missoula, and also in the lower Clark Fork and also in Lake Pend Oreille, we have what's called diatom algae, which is attached algae that grows on the rock, which is normally what we think of when we think of algae. Some people call it slime on the rocks. So that's diatom algae. So those are the two things that we are looking to try to reduce. One of the issues that we have in the watershed, because it is so huge and it crosses 3 states, is the number of jurisdictions involved. So I'm going to leave the nutrient issue for just a minute and just kind of rattle off the list of jurisdictions that there are across this watershed. First of all, there's 2 regions of EPA. Couldn't be simple. We had to be in 2 regions of EPA. So Montana is in Region 8, Idaho and Washington are in Region 10. We're, of course, 3 states, Montana, Idaho, and Washington. 14 counties. There are 3 tribal reservations. There are 9 national forests. There are 12 conservation districts. And then, of course, there are dozens of cities and incorporated cities, incorporated towns, non-incorporated towns, and small communities of varying sizes. Missoula, of course, being the largest population center in the watershed. So just a little, we'll get to that later on, but I just want to make sure you understand that complex water quality issues and maybe complicated even further with this other layer of the many jurisdictions. So it's really kind of hard to say one entity, one agency is in charge, because there's really no one entity in charge. So how we got started. The story begins back in the early 1980s. And we're going to go back to that algae that I was just telling you about. And in the early 1980s, people here in Missoula, and also people living on Lake Pend Oreille, started becoming concerned because the river and the lake were experiencing rapid increased growth of algae and weeds. And people who had lived around this area for their whole lives were beginning to get really concerned because they could tell there was something going on. They could see a really big difference. And they got concerned enough that the congressional delegates from Montana and Idaho got together. And at the time, Congress was reauthorizing the Clean Water Act. This was in 1987. And when the Clean Water Act was reauthorized, there was a section put in the Clean Water Act, which is still in there because the Clean Water Act has not been rewritten yet. So there's a section called 525, and that section calls for EPA to study pollution and the sources of pollution in the Clark Fork Pend Oreille watershed. It's a 1 paragraph, it's probably only 3-4 sentences long, and it directs EPA to figure out what's going on in this watershed and present a report to Congress. So about a year later, there was actually some funding appropriated so that somebody could actually do something about this Section 525 in the Clean Water Act. And about $1.5 million were Congress appropriated and gave those funds to the 2 regions of EPA. And then the 2 regions passed the monies on to the 3 states and said, go do good things. Go find out what you can about what's going on in the watershed. So obviously the state of Montana studied the Clark Fork River, and the state of Idaho studied the lake, and the state of Washington studied the Pend Oreille River. And they did that for 3 years. And there was a steering committee made up of 5 people that oversaw this project. And it was 1 person from Region 8, EPA Region 8, 1 person from Region 10, and then 1 person each from the 3 state water quality agencies. And those 5 people were the steering committee for this $1.5 million study. And after the end of the few years, they compiled all the data and put it into a report. And again, this was just focused on nutrients. They realized with $1.5 million, there wasn't really much they could do. That was going to be like a drop in the bucket with, compared to the amount of money that was being spent on, say, heavy metals pollution in the watershed. So the focus was on nutrients of the study. And these 5 people got together and developed a report to Congress. And it was sort of a state of the basin. Here's what we found. Here's what's going on. And, but they didn't just stop there, which was really pretty nifty. These 5 people got together and decided, well, we're not going to just stop there. We're going to make this a management plan, and we're going to make recommendations on how we think some of the problems could be solved. And so they developed this document. It's only about a ½ inch thick, and it lays out about 70 different options of things that they thought, measures that they thought communities, agencies, local and state governments could implement that would reduce nutrients and make a difference in algae growth in the watershed. And they sent that report to Congress. Now, those 70 options, they not only did the 70 options, they took the 70 options and they developed their top 10 priorities. This is the top 10 things we think should happen. Well, the first of those top 10 things was establish a stakeholder organization that we can hand this document to and we can tell them, go make this happen. Take this and make it happen. Because even back then, which was in 1992 when the document came out, they recognized that as EPA or the states, if they walked into a community and said, well, we're the federal government and we're here to kind of help you out and tell you what to do, they would probably not get a real excited response from folks. So they said, let's set up a stakeholder group, and that's how the Tri-State Water Quality Council came to be born. So that was in 1993. The first meeting of the group took place in October of 1993. And I have to tell you, I remember that day. I remember that day for a couple of different reasons. I remember the day because it was my first day of work. They hired me to be the director and pull it all together and invite people and bring them to the table. So I remember that because it was very exciting, career-wise. I also remember it because the night before, we had a fire in our house, and so we were living in a hotel. I didn't have all my clothes, everything was smoke damaged. The whole house was smoke damaged. And we were staying in a hotel, and I had to borrow an outfit from a girlfriend to wear because all of our clothes were ruined. And so it was an exciting day. I'm looking up there because my husband's here and he remembers it well. But was actually more fascinating than all of that about the day was that there were people sitting around the table. We had invited 30 people. And there were people sitting around the table who had never met each other before, had no idea. A lot of them had no idea that the communities being represented around the table were probably in the watershed. They probably didn't even realize the breadth and the size of the watershed. So we had a gentleman from Butte, Montana, sitting next to a gentleman from Newport, Washington. And we had a gentleman from Stone Container Corporation sitting next to a representative from the city of Sandpoint. And it was just the most amazing day. And the folks there each had their own value that they placed on their part of the watershed. But something just sort of transpired in the room that day, and they all realized, we're not sure what we're getting into. We're not quite sure what you're asking of us, but we all feel committed enough that we want to do something here as a group and try to make some headway in improving the pollution situation, the nutrient pollution situation in the Clark Fork Pend Oreille watershed. And we went around the room at the end of the 6 hours, and each person said, sign me up, I'm here, I will serve on this council, and I'll do what I can to help. So who are those people? We have a number of cities represented. The city of Missoula is on the council, as well as the city of Sandpoint, the city of Deer Lodge, the city of Butte, Missoula County. We have Smurfit Stone Container, Montana Rail Link. We have 3 conservation districts, one from each of the states, the Bitterroot Conservation District from Montana, the Bonner Soil and Water Conservation District from Idaho, and the Pend Oreille Conservation District from Washington. We have some environmental consulting firms to help us out with information when we need it. We have 3 utilities. We have Montana PPNL, Avista, and Pend Oreille PUD. We have a couple of citizen organizations. The Clark Fork Coalition sits on the council, as well as the Rock Creek Alliance. We have all 3 tribes that have reservations in the watershed are on the council, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe, the Kalispel tribe, and the Kootenai tribe. And then we also have a few federal agencies. We have the National Park Service, we have the Forest Service, we have the Natural Resources Conservation Service. The two regions of EPA hold two non-voting seats on the council. And then each of the three states' water quality agencies are on the council as well. So the state of Montana Department of Environmental Quality, the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality, and the Washington Department of Ecology. So I put the list in front of me because I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anybody. But it's just a really tremendous group of people. But getting back, just the point that I wanted to make, an important point that I wanted to make about that first day, not only that commitment and that sort of shared value that everyone decided that they had after just meeting, was that it could have, right from that first day, kind of floundered miserably, and here's why. These days, when watershed groups form, they generally form because they're all committed to making a difference in their watershed, and they need to find out more about what's going on. So they generally start with studies. They study, they assess, they figure out what's going on, they sit down to the table together, work through the information, and then they lay a plan of what they're going to do, and they're all there from day one, and they all have buy-in. Well, with our group, what happened was everybody walks in. First of all, they don't even know each other. But secondly of all, they are handed a document that's been prepared by 5 agencies. They've been handed a document and said, go do good things. And they had no buy-in. They had no experience with the development of that. And they were being asked to go out and do some pretty substantial measures, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. And it just really fascinates me when I think about it that the group rose to the occasion, because I have seen similar situations where groups were handed a document and said, well, we've figured out all the stuff. You guys just kind of go do this. And it generally doesn't work. You generally need to have people who are committed because they've been in it and engaged in it and understand it, and they have, like I say, buy-in in it. So was it the chemistry of the group that day? Probably so. But people, individuals have come and gone. The same entities are represented. So I don't know that it's necessarily was just the chemistry of those particular people in the room. But whatever it is, it seems to have worked. So now I'm going to talk about some of the projects that we have worked on. And in doing so, I'm hoping that I can help you to understand a little bit of the on-the-groundness of this, the nuts and bolts of it. Okay, so that's great. You got a group and everything's going on. And so what are you doing and how are you doing it? Well, the council only meets twice a year. Like I say, it's around 30 people, and they only meet twice a year. So that's not a real good formula for probably getting a whole lot done. So the way they have organized themselves is they have established committees, and these committees operate in to come up with a threshold number and then to figure out how they were going to meet that number, because they all exceeded the number that they came up with. They all exceeded the number. Their discharges all exceeded that number, significantly exceeded that number. So it took them 2 years alone to just come up with the number. It was a long, involved process of going through the data, going through studies. One of the entities at the table actually said, let's bring in a third-party independent review of all the information to see if, if this number that we're thinking about is the right one or not. And remarkably, what kind of happened at the end of the 2 years and after the third-party review was undertaken, and they found out that, yes, in fact, this number was probably about the best number anybody could come up with. The discharges all got together and said, well, let's make it even more stringent than that. Let's challenge ourselves here and make it even more stringent than the data suggests it should be. So that number became the target. It's for total phosphorus. There's a number for total phosphorus. There's a number for total nitrogen. There's a number for algae growth in any one place, growing at any one time in the river. Those are all, there's targets, there's threshold numbers set for all of those things. And the document, however, is not called a TMDL. The document is called a Voluntary Nutrient Reduction Program. And we called it that because the state of Montana agreed that they would allow these dischargers, they would give them 10 years in order to meet the targets. At the time, they probably wouldn't do that today. But at the time, this was almost 10 years ago, the state of Montana did not have rules and guidelines for how they were going to do TMDLs. So this was the first case out of the chute, and they decided they would go with the program. They could see everybody was working really hard to come up with ways that they were going to reduce their nutrient pollution into the Clark Fork River, and the state decided to give them a window of opportunity, a 10-year window of opportunity to do what they said they were going to do. Some of the things they said they were going to do. The city of Missoula, and some of you may be aware of this, especially people in the room who are perhaps ratepayers in the city of Missoula. City of Missoula is spending, I believe it's nearly $16 million to build a biological nutrient removal facility at the wastewater treatment plant. Major commitment. The city of Deer Lodge, they took their discharge completely out of the river. They don't discharge into the river during the summer at all anymore. They are taking their discharge and land applying it on hay fields at the Grant Coors Ranch during the summer months. Summer months are the problem area because that's when the water warms up and the sun is out the most. So you have the most light, you have the most warmth, and then when you add to that a bunch of nutrients, algae grows like crazy. So summer are the critical months. So, so Deer Lodge taken their discharge out of the river entirely. Butte, the city of Butte is doing several different things. And part of what they are doing is they're land applying. They bought some land and are built a sod farm, and they are land applying a portion of their effluent on the sod farm. So they're applying nutrient-rich wastewater to grow sod, and then they sell the sod. So they've turned it into an enterprise. And Smurfit Stone Container, they have done several things, which is pretty much, they've already met the target, the number that they needed to meet. They have done several, they've just had to do some tweaking at the plant with a couple of their treatment operations without going into the detail of it. They have changed the way that they're running some of their treatment methodologies so that their nutrients are not going into the river. And their ponds, which they were having a lot of trouble with nutrients seeping out of their ponds. If any of you have ever been out to the Frenchtown, the pulp mill there, and they have those big ponds where they put a lot of their their water before they discharge it into the river, they were having problems with nutrients seeping out of the ponds closest to the river, seeping into the river. So during the summer months, they don't use the ponds closest to the river. So just a couple of things that they've done there that have helped tremendously. Over the course of the 10 years, we are anticipating with all of the measures, all of the signatories to the VNRP are spending approximately $62 million as a group to make these measures work, to implement these measures. And by the end of the 10 years, we are expecting to see anywhere from an 80 to 90% reduction in the nutrients going into the Clark Fork River from those sources. Something kind of unexpected happened along the way. After they settled on a number, and like I said, we were 2 years into it, the city of Missoula, the representative from the city of Missoula showed up at a council meeting, and the council was expecting to just kind of sign the thing. They thought it was about done. They thought it was about wrapped up. And the representative from the city of Missoula came in and said, you know, we're ready to spend whatever we have to spend to make a difference. But we know that there's also a problem with septics. And we know that there's also a problem with other non-point sources. So we're not prepared to sign on to this VNRP until the committee reconvenes and we figure out a way to deal with other issues besides the 4 major point source dischargers. So the group went back to the drawing board for another 2.5 years, and they got Missoula City County Health Department and the county commissioners engaged, and therefore, because of that, there have been a number of septic systems here in the Missoula Valley that have been gradually, since the VNRP got signed, have been gradually being added on to the system. And then there's also, they set a 20% non-point source reduction, sort of a target for the rest of the watershed. So the VNRP covers from the headwaters of Butte all the way down to where the Flathead comes into the Clark Fork. So about a 200-mile stretch of river. But again, most of the activities associated with that are happening kind of right here. And it was just an incredible, I mean, that was really major. At the time, like I say, TMDLs weren't really happening, and now they're kind of like, you can't hardly talk to anybody about water quality or a water body without hearing about a TMDL that's being developed for impaired waters. And so we feel like we got on the front end of it and brought in folks and had them develop their ideas of how they thought they could meet the targets. And we're really very proud of that program. And that program, by the way, is, I think we're closing in on, I think, almost 5 years. And I believe the city of Missoula's biological nutrient removal facility, I think, is going to be maybe operational this summer. I'm not positive of that, but I think it's going to be online fairly soon. So that's an example of how we combine good science with collaboration. And that, I think, is probably one of the strongest examples that I can give you of that. However, there are others, and I'll be briefer about the others. I won't go into as much detail because I do want to leave time for questions. But after spending some time working on, while we were working on the VNRP, the council decided that, well, you know, any of these projects that we're going to be doing over the course of however many years we're going to be doing them, we really need to be collecting water quality data so we know if we're making progress or not. So we called together the 3 states and got everybody into a room, and we said, what kind of water quality monitoring are you doing? So we can see kind of what's going on out there in the world, and then we can figure out if more monitoring needs to happen or if we need to tweak what's going on. Well, we found out something kind of interesting. We found out that the state of Montana had a tremendous program of 30-some sites up and down the Clark Fork River monthly for like 17 years. They'd been monitoring. But they were monitoring a site at Cabinet Gorge, which is right near on the Montana-Idaho border. And directly across the river from where the state of Montana had been monitoring for almost 17 years, the state of Idaho was monitoring and had been monitoring for about a dozen years. And we found out that on the boundary of Idaho and Washington, the state of Washington was doing water quality monitoring at Newport, right at the border. And the state of Idaho was doing monitoring kind of right across the river at Newport as well for like a dozen years. So what we found out was that there was a lot of duplication of effort and probably not a real efficient use of funds or resources. And no one single entity was looking at all the information across the whole watershed. So we decided, well, we were probably the group that was going to have to pick up that ball and run with it. So we did. We designed, over the course of the next couple of years, we designed a 3-state water quality monitoring program. It is our program. The states no longer do the monitoring. They've passed all of their, all of it onto us, and we do the monitoring. And we look at the information because we're the one entity that is looking across the whole watershed. And we look at that information. And in fact, when you do trends, when you're looking for trends to see whether nutrients are going down or whether algae growth is improving, you really need 5 to 10 years of data at a time. And so we just finished our first trends analysis for the first 5 years of data that we collected 1998 through 2002. And we're just finishing up that report. And maybe I can come back at some time and tell you what's in that report. We're just finishing it up, but primarily just sort of in a nutshell, because I don't want to get sidetracked with that, but kind of in a nutshell, what we're finding is when we took that 5 years of data and we compared it to the data that had been collected by the states all those years before, we're finding that, in fact, nutrients, the trend in nutrients is going down. And nutrients are being reduced across the watershed. We wish we could say the same yet for algae growth. It looks like there is no trend in algae growth really one way or the other at this point. We suspect as we get closer to meeting the targets of the VNRP that we will begin to see a more significant trend in algae growth, and we can say, yes, it is declining, but right now we're not able to do that. But we are very excited to be able to say that, yes, phosphorus and nitrogen are coming down, and that's a good thing. So then another program that we're working on that also was based on science and collaboration was working downstream to protect Idaho's Lake Pend Oreille. And as I said earlier, Lake Pend Oreille gets 90% of its water, and about 75 to 80% of the nutrients come into the lake from Montana, because the Clark Fork River just provides pretty much most of the volume of the lake. So you not only get the water, but you get what's in the water. So we knew that if we were going to protect Lake Pend Oreille and do some good things with Lake Pend Oreille, we were going to need to control what was coming in from Montana. So we were able to facilitate an agreement between the two states. We got the, and it was interesting because it seemed like Montana had maybe a little more to that they would have to give, and Idaho had more to gain, but we actually had a harder time getting Idaho to the table. I think it was because Lake Pend Oreille is not impaired. It's not on the danger list. In fact, Lake Pend Oreille is really in pretty good shape. And I think the state just felt like, well, you know, we've got all these other streams and all these other water bodies that need our help and need our attention and need our money and need our staffing, and we really don't want to spend the time and the resources on a body of water that's not even impaired yet. So we suggested to them that wouldn't it maybe be a good use of staff time and resources to work on a body of water to keep it from becoming impaired. And they eventually saw the light and came to the table. And so we spent about a year negotiating with the two states, facilitating negotiations between the two states, and finally the two directors of the two state water quality agencies did sign an agreement. And again, it sets thresholds, it sets a number, and the state of Montana is agreeing that they will hold the nutrients coming into the lake at a set number, which is based on how they calculated what they needed, how they needed to meet nutrient reduction for the VNRP. And then Idaho is going to do its part by working in the communities around the lake to try to reduce pollution coming from the communities around the lake as well, because you can't do one without the other. So that agreement was signed a couple of years ago, and ever since then, we've been working on a program then to develop a TMDL, develop a plan for reducing nutrients coming into the lake from the local communities around the lake. And we have a really great committee working in Sandpoint that is real dedicated. Again, these were folks that didn't know each other all that much when they got together, but now we've got the county planner and representatives from the city and representatives from the conservation district and all of the sewer districts and a couple of agencies, and they've developed a plan that we're going to take out to the public this summer to see what the public thinks of it. So anyway, so those are some examples of some of the programs that we work on to try to get things done on the ground. And once we get, I think a lot of it is policy. Because when you're working on a watershed that's this huge, it's, for instance, difficult for us to respond to a phone call that comes into the office when someone's asking us to get involved in a subdivision that's being planned in one of the communities, and can we maybe get involved in helping them fight it or whatever the request may be. And so our organization generally, when those kinds of things come along, we have to really decline being involved because there are other groups and organizations that do those kinds of things. Like for instance, here in Missoula, you have the Clark Fork Coalition, which is a tremendous advocacy organization for clean water. But we've sort of found our niche as the group that's trying to keep our eye on the big picture and help with the policies that are being developed at the state and federal level that sets the tone then for what local communities are able to accomplish. So we feel like that's sort of the niche that we need to stick with. Most recently, how am I doing on time? Am I doing? Oh, gee. Oh, okay. Just one last thing, and then we can open it up to questions. Sorry, I didn't realize that. Our most recent success is we heard about EPA was initiating a large watershed grant program, a national watershed grant program called the Watershed Initiative. And they were going to offer up to $1 million in grants, and they anticipated funding 20 projects across the nation. And they were going to award $1 million to 20 groups to do on-the-ground restoration projects. So I haven't even really gotten into, we've done some dairy projects and some stream and fish habitat improvement projects. Haven't even gotten into those, and I'm not going to. But they were looking for groups that had projects ready to go, designed, ready to go out the door. All they needed was the money to fund them. So this was an interesting exercise in collaboration because we started talking to other organizations that are working in the watershed, like the Blackfoot Challenge and the Bitterroot Watershed Partnership, and the folks up in the Flathead Basin Commission, and a new group working in the Upper Clark Fork called the Clark Fork Restoration Coalition, Watershed Restoration Coalition. And they were all like, well, we're certainly going to apply for a grant, aren't you? And we kind of all got together and went, you know, if we're all competing against each other, and this is a national competition, what do you suppose the chances are that any one of us is going to get a grant when we're competing? We're all competing against each other, and we're competing against, you know, who knows how many hundreds of other watershed groups across the country are going to apply. So we got together and we applied together as a collaborative effort. And we'd never done anything like this with other groups, and they weren't quite sure they knew who we were, and we'd heard all about them but hadn't really done anything with them. So we all got together and put together a grant proposal, which our development director, Diane Williams, prepared, and we submitted it, and we ended up getting the grant. And it was really an interesting phenomena because Congress ended up not funding it to the level of $20 million. So EPA did not have 20 $1 million grants to give out, but they still gave us $1 million, and the Clark Fork Pend Oreille watershed ranked #1 in the nation, and got only one of $3 million grants. So that was very exciting, and we just thought that was pretty cool, that our little watershed that we, of course, all think is wonderful, that somebody else thought was wonderful too, and thought that the collaborative approach that we were taking with 5 groups combined was kind of what they were looking for. So we were very excited about that, and that project is just getting underway, and it's all on the ground. It's all working with some dairy farmers up the Bitterroot to reduce nutrients from their lagoon, the dairy lagoons. It's several large stream restoration projects. It's several large wetlands and riparian fencing projects. It's all on the ground, and we're very, very excited to work with the Blackfoot Challenge, the Bitterroot Watershed Partnership, the Flathead Basin Commission, and the Upper Clark Fork Watershed Restoration Coalition on that project. So I think I should open it up to questions. Oh, sure. Oh, okay, sure. Yes.
Whenever I think about some collaborative conservation efforts, I always think, yeah, I want to get all these stakeholders involved, and then I look at the telephone because I don't really want to call people who probably don't like me or don't agree with me. So the question I've been wondering about for a long time is how do you, the concrete part of getting stakeholders involved, that's always eluded me. And then when I was thinking about other stakeholders, to what extent are agriculture interests, farmers, ranchers involved in this, probably through their local watershed movements maybe, and how big is their impact? I was a little surprised at the sheer amount of it coming from these cities. I figured it would be all from ranches. That's just kind of the misinformation that goes around.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions, and she's asked me to repeat the questions in the microphone. So the first one was, how do you get stakeholders involved? How do you get them engaged? Well, sometimes you do have to pick up the phone and call people that you, that you think don't agree with you. I think people have to understand that if they do get involved, that there's an incentive for them to get involved. That there's something that some goal of theirs that they can meet, or something that they can contribute to the process, so that they need to understand what the process is, how they can contribute to it, and why they should get involved. I think it sort of goes to sort of an education kind of thing. Like a lot of times I'll find that when we try to get a group of people engaged on a specific issue, and oftentimes you will find the same 5 or 6 people show up. And sometimes you just have to make those cold calls and get those feelers out of the community and bring people in, and they might surprise you. An instance comes to mind when we were trying to get a sewer into a community, get a community to sewer. And there was one person who kept coming to every meeting, and she was the most adamant opponent. And every meeting, she would just take up 3/4 of the meeting, complaining and saying how awful this was. The board had a vacancy, and they asked her to sit on the board. And she accepted. And she ended up, a year later, voting for the sewer. Because once she got involved, she could see why they were trying to make it happen. And she could put her personal agenda aside and see what was the end point here and why it was a good thing for the community. So sometimes bringing in the people that you think are going to, be a cog in the wheel ends up being a truly remarkable phenomena. So you might give that a try. And then your other question was about agriculture and why they're not. And you know, in some of the tributaries they are a very high percentage. It's just that the studies that were the 525 studies that were done specifically for the main stem of the Clark Fork. So bigger picture, and in the really big picture of things in the main stem of the Clark Fork, it was those point source dischargers that were the major problem. Now, as those reduce, then yeah, the next level is getting more of the agriculture and silvicultural entities engaged and involved, because their percentage then will become higher as we start reducing some of the other sources. And then there was another question in there?
No,
Oh.
just how, to what extent the agricultural and then you brought up forestry
Mhm.
being involved, because it's not, I guess why that was in my head is because they're not so much point source.
They're not.
And so
Mhm.
individual numbers are small.
Yes.
Is there data on, I mean, if you're sorting chemicals out of water, it would be very difficult to say where it came from.
Mm-hmm.
Just how much of that is non-4-point discharge?
Right.
And how much of that is attributable to ag and now forestry? But, I mean, you kind of answered.
Okay, good. Yeah, the majority of it is the point sources, but as we get those reduced, the non-point sources will become obviously more important and the next level to be working on. And not across the whole watershed either, just in some segments. Any other questions? Lori?
Can you tell us, since the three cities are such major point sources, is it human waste? And I guess my question is this just something that is just something that happens when people live in a dense area like a city?
Mhm.
Or are there things that we can do as consumers, like buy phosphate-free detergents, or does that matter?
Yes, actually it does. The question is it about people and dense populations of people? And that's exactly what it is. The cities discharge wastewater, all the wastewater is collected from homes, it goes to the treatment facility, it's treated, and then it's discharged directly into the Clark Fork River. So all the wastewater, all the sewage, it's separated out, and the solid sewage is separated out from what the liquid that results after the treatment, and then that liquid is discharged into the river. So it is all about dense populations of people and their waste and dealing with that waste. And actually, in the 80s, I think it was, 80s, there was a phosphate detergent ban put into place here in Missoula, and also quite a few of the other communities along the Clark Fork River, and then actually we did them in the communities around the lake as well. So, and one of the very first things that the council did back in 1993 was we did a shelf survey in grocery stores around the whole three-state watershed, and there are no phosphate detergents sold anywhere in the watershed. The only phosphate product that you will find is dishwasher detergent, because at the time when the phosphate bans were enacted, there was no mainstream liquid or powder detergent that you use in your dishwasher, not that you hand wash with, but that you use in a dishwasher. There was no detergent on the market that was phosphate-free. So the cities that passed and the counties that passed the phosphate detergent ban ordinances didn't feel that it was fair to the consumer to tell them they couldn't use their dishwashers. So the phosphate detergents on the shelves, the dishwasher detergents on the shelves do have some phosphates. Liquids have less phosphates in them than the powders. So liquid. Or you can go to the health food store and you can buy phosphate-free dishwasher detergent at a health food store. But if you go to Safeway, the products will have some phosphorus in them. And yeah, it does make a huge difference. It makes a huge difference. I know when Missoula passed their ban, you could see almost immediately And in the graphs that they showed of their of the wastewater and they measure their discharges right where it goes into the river, and you could see the difference was tremendous. And when Sandpoint passed theirs, they had a 40% reduction in the phosphorus that they were discharging from a phosphate detergent ban. So yeah, we can make a difference. We can make a difference, but the more people that there are, the more of a difference we have to work on to make. And other questions? Yes.
Just purely personal curiosity.
Uh-huh.
I kayak like 3 or 4 days a week, and I have a lot of friends, and we often hear about how polluted Clarksburg is. Would you spend 4 hours a day with your head in the water?
Would I spend 4 hours a day with my head underwater? Not all at one time.
Are curious about all the heavy metals and stuff in the river, and would you swim in it or kind of?
I would probably feel okay swimming in it. I don't think I'd drink the water. I don't think I would drink the water. In fact, I'm sure I wouldn't drink the water. Swimming in it, quite frankly, there are some times of the year when I would be reluctant to do so, because there are still heavy metals that are in the floodplain in the upper river. And when there are real severe thunderstorms and the rain can then cause polluted runoff to get into the river, there are still fish kills. There are still fish kills in the upper Clark Fork from the heavy metals that are in the sediments along the floodplain. So there would be times of year when it would not be really terribly safe to be in the Clark Fork River. And for years, Silver Bow Creek, which is in the headwaters up there near the upper Clark Fork, had signs all up and down it: contaminated water, do not swim. Yeah, right. Yes.
I know this may not be in your purview with your organization, but what is going on with some of the work to remove the heavy metals? That's one question.
Okay.
He went out to the wastewater treatment plant, and the man out there who's running it said that his biggest concern that we might see in the next decade or sooner would be effects from like antibiotics and other medications that we take that go into the water. So I'm wondering about both those things.
Okay, so heavy metals and antibiotics. Okay. I'm not an authority on either. Heavy metals, I can just tell you in general, again, they're mostly concentrated in the area from the headwaters to Milltown Dam. And that is the area, as I understand it, of contamination. And the federal government has a program called the Superfund program. And Superfund has spent, I believe, millions and millions and millions of dollars, lots of money, to clean up the heavy metals contamination. And it's an issue not just in the riverbed itself, but as I was saying a few minutes ago, in the floodplain as well. Because apparently and it's from past mining in primarily the Butte and Anaconda area for many, many decades. There were huge mines, and what they did then, because they didn't think it would be a problem and they didn't know any better, and it was their method of getting rid of the waste, they would take the tailings, what was left over after they got the good ore out, and they'd take the rest of it, and they would just pile it along the edge of the river, figuring that in spring, when the floods came, it would wash the stuff downstream, and then they wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. So what that ended up doing over decades and decades was contaminating the floodplain. And those metals don't just go away very quickly. They have a long shelf life. So they're still problematic. What's being done, I think a lot of material has actually been taken out and removed, and then they've figured they can't take it all, though, so some of it, I think, is just stabilized as best as they can. But I truly, if I say anything more, I will totally be speaking out of my realm. I just know a lot's happened and a lot of money's being spent, and they are assuming that they're getting a handle on it. I think they're finally getting to the point where they can say they're getting a handle on it. And I do believe that's why they're also feeling a little more comfortable about the possibility of taking out the Milltown Dam. The antibiotics, I would agree that probably there'll be all kinds of things that we'll find in the future that will be problematic. Again, it's just, you know, the more people we have and the more people that we're trying to service with our facilities, the more chances of, you know, things happening. But I really don't know anything more than that's just a, you know, one of those things. Another question? Yes, ma'am.
I know that most of your efforts, sort of for remediation of point source problems that are pre-existing. What kind of efforts are you taking for prevention of large point source pollution problems? You know, things specifically like the Rock Creek mine and stuff like that that are proposed in the future?
Oh, excellent question. Did everybody hear that? She wants to know what our group is doing as far as proposed projects or projects that aren't in existence yet, but could be or might be. As far as specifically the proposed Rock Creek mine, we have communicated with the state of Montana on numerous occasions our concerns about what could potentially be in the discharge, and have made formal comments on when they did their work on the discharge permit, when they held public hearings, and we're not taking a position of no mine, no way. But we are saying if you're going to allow this mine, then the discharge needs to not make a problem, because we've been busy reducing problems. And it was really interesting, but at one of our VNRP committee meetings, here's all these point source dischargers in this area, in this part of the watershed, sitting there hammering out how they're going to spend millions of dollars to reduce nutrients going into the river. And two gentlemen from the mining company came to this committee meeting and gave this little slideshow presentation of their proposed mine and of their discharge. And boy, did they get a talking to. I don't think they were expecting it. But these point source dischargers were looking at them and saying, look, we're spending a bunch of money and we're doing all we can to reduce. Don't you even think about adding something. So it was kind of a fascinating thing. And so that's what our organization is saying, okay, no net increase. We can't increase. We're working hard to reduce. We can't have an increase. And hopefully that's what ends up in the permit. Yes?
Touch real quick on maybe biological process that the algae and weeds, how they cause a reduction in oxygen in the water.
I would if I could. But I have to tell you, I'm not a scientist. I'm the PR person. So I really do not quite understand what goes on there, except that it has to do with the oxygen that's in the water column, and that the plants, when there's too much of it, they use it up somehow during their process of photosynthesis. But I know exactly who could answer that question for you. Here on campus, Dr. Vicki Watson. Dr. Vicki Watson actually does all of the Tri-State Council's algae monitoring for us, and she is the algae queen. And you look up Dr. Vicki Watson, tell her Ruth sent you, and you ask her the question, okay? Other question? Yes.
You already discontinued forestry and agriculture as a major contributor to the nitrogen and phosphorus. You also said Smurfit Stone was on board as one of the four major point sources. Well, how else is the industry going to be involved in this one way or another as a contributor, even if not one of the four biggest point sources across the three states?
You mean how will forestry and agriculture be involved?
How will manufacturing industry, Smurfit Stone, is what recycling?
They make cardboard. Mm-hmm. Okay.
How is manufacturing, things like that, can be involved in other states or areas?
How is other manufacturing other than Smurfit Stone going to be involved in helping to reduce nutrient pollution? That's a great question. Right now, we're not really working with any other industrial discharger directly. We have talked with, on numerous occasions with ASME, which is in Butte, and they are I believe they have something to do with silicone, and they discharge into a ditch that then flows into the Clark Fork, and we have visited with them, and their permit, the levels in their permit do not exceed any of the thresholds that have been set for the Clark Fork River, so their discharge is not problematic. Other than that, right now, we're not working with any other industrial dischargers. Does that answer your question? I mean, it wasn't an answer, but does that?
Manufacturing isn't going to be about labor either, further downstream?
Well, they certainly could be, but like for instance, in the city of Missoula, if you've got manufacturing facilities that have a discharge, that have a waste product, like they're discharging water from their facility, that gets pre-treated and goes to the city's facility. They don't have their own discharge going into the river. So it goes through the city's facility. So we're dealing with them because they are, indirectly, because they're discharging through the city's treatment plant. Does that, okay.
Largest future threat to the watershed, or maybe what you guys are sort of turning your focus to?
Oh, that's a good question. Largest threat. Well, certainly from Idaho's perspective, I think the largest threat is if the Rock Creek Mine were to become operational. I think for downstream of the Rock Creek Mine, that's probably the biggest threat to Lake Pend Oreille and the Pend Oreille River. As far as the watershed as a whole, I'm not sure it's nutrient pollution. You know, I think we're getting a handle on some things. It's probably just growth in general, you know, and as more people come to the area, as we're getting a handle on the current levels, as population increases, as far as nutrients go, we're going to have to constantly be kind of keeping ahead of the curve. But there may be other pollution problems that come along that's not maybe so much nutrients in the future, because I think we're at least attempting to get a handle on that part of it anyway. But I think that proposed mine could be an issue downstream. Thank you guys. Thank you very much. Thank you.